You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the BioHealth Capital Region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk, and we had a little preliminary chat with our guest today to let him know he's our most frequent guest we've had on BioTalk, because he basically has relevant news that's interesting to all of our listeners, wherever you may be in the United States or internationally. So I think actually, Alex, this is the fourth appearance you've had on BioTalk, and probably will continue on an annual basis based on what you bring to our listeners. So we have Alex Philippidis, who's the Senior Business Editor, Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, with us today. Alex, how are you?
Oh, very well, Rich. Thank you for having me on, and thanks for the bit of history. I'd lost count after 3.
Yeah. Well, when you have good things to say for people that is interesting to them about what the state of our industry is, which everybody's interested in these days, it's great to have you back. And really, you're back a little bit earlier than past years, because we always bring you back when you do your top 10 biopharma cluster ranking in Gen. And it might be a couple weeks earlier, but that's why we're doing it earlier with you, because we want it to be fresh news for everybody rather than be old news. So like we do traditionally, Alex, you might give the listeners a little background on your history so they know how you got to where you are today with Gen.
Sure thing. And I guess when it comes to what I do, I've always wanted to know how the world works and to share what I found out with others. And my father was a big newspaper reader growing up, so I gravitated toward writing for various local newspapers where I live. And well, then almost 20 years ago, I shifted to writing about biotech, first for a biotech economic development newsletter that was published at the time by Genome Web, which has actually a whole online service and a lot of very good tools and technology writing. And then since 2011, I've been covering biotech business news for my current employer, Gen, or Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News. And Gen is the oldest publication devoted exclusively to biotech. It was founded in 1981 by Mary Ann Liebert, who built an eponymous company around Gen and now has more than 90 biotech and medical and technology and law and even policy journals. So we have a monthly print magazine and dozens of articles that we publish online on our website, which is genengnews.com, GENENGNEWS.com. And a couple of years ago, we launched our own peer-reviewed journal, Gen Biotechnology.
Well, great history. And really, you've been tracking sort of the growth of biotechnology for over a decade now, but we made the transition to call it biohealth. I don't know if you're ever going to go to biohealth news, Alex, but I'm sure that there's a reason for keeping it biotechnology. We're seeing the conversion of technology and bio coming together these days, which I know you're reporting on as well. But the other thing that I'll tell the listeners is, for those who haven't seen Alex live, he comes to our BioHealth Capital Region Forum every year to discuss what's going on in the industry and talk about the top 10 biopharma cluster ranking. We'll talk about this again later in our interview with him, but I think he's been to at least 4 of our BioHealth Capital Region conferences, Alex. Is that correct?
Let me check. I was in person in 2019. Virtual during the COVID years, and then back in person in 2022 and 23.
Yeah, so 3 in person and 2 virtual.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess that's 5.
5, holy cow. It'll be 6th appearance this year. My goodness. You haven't overstayed your welcome, and we're going to welcome you back again.
Well, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, and the reason we're chatting today is that you just released the 2024 top 10 biopharma cluster ranking yesterday. And for the listeners, we're taping this on Thursday, July 25th, and actually it was released on Wednesday, July 24th, 2024. So before we go into the ranking, talk a little bit about the origin and why you're doing this annually, Alex.
About 10 years ago, we saw at Gen that there were several biotech news outlets that attempted to figure out where the hotspots were for the industry. And each attempt had its own criteria, its own read, its own results, quite frankly. So we attempted it because I had the background in covering biotech economic development. And the key sticking point, and which took a while, was to figure out what the criteria would be. And I wanted things that were numerical, that could be duplicated, that would be less subject to question than if you say, well, here's my take of what's up and coming, because everybody's got a different opinion and they're going to clash over it. So in about 2014 was my first effort, and the cluster lists have been annual since then. What's interesting with that first list was, in the first list, San Francisco was the top region. And there was still a sense back then that Boston and Cambridge were playing catch up. Now that flipped around the following year, 2015, so that Boston and Cambridge were on top, and it stayed that way for 9 years until last year, where we had that flip at the top and San Francisco coming in. And I can go into a little bit of why now or wait till later.
Go for it. You're on a roll, Alex.
Okay.
So continue on.
Sure. Last year, coming out of COVID, the San Francisco Bay Area saw more venture capital financing activity. And it was largely on that San Francisco nosed out Boston and Cambridge when we did the list last year. And this year, it's a little bit back to what we've seen in recent years, with Boston, Cambridge clearly on top. Just to show you, for San Francisco, we had a figure of roughly $10 billion in this past year, whereas Boston, Cambridge was close to $11 billion. So the figure, we had $10.71 billion for Boston, Cambridge, $10.38 for San Francisco Bay. That's still fairly close as these things go, but it was enough, obviously, for Boston, Cambridge. Now, what's so far in the first half of this year, we're seeing San Francisco slightly ahead, but this thing, it's like a horse race.
Yeah. Well, really, between the two, you basically have the highest concentration of venture capital, and they represent, 70% of the venture cap, 70 to 80% of the venture capital that we have in the United States in two large markets, which continues to be true. But the interesting thing about the rankings, which you're going to get into, and the other criteria, which you can tell the listeners about, it's not just about the money. It's about a number of other things that go into the criteria that really help build a biopharma ecosystem in a cluster. Correct, Alex?
Sure. Actually, there are 5 criteria that we've held to, where you can get objective numbers, where you can find them either publicly accessible, or if you ask nicely, you can find it from a private source. And the latter would be true, for example, of lab space, even venture capital funding. When we first did the lists a decade ago, PwC had a public database that anybody could plug into. But as it turns out, the regions are even closer watchers and trackers of their own activity in that. So I tend to defer to the regions on venture capital, although as a backstop, I'll also reach out to PitchBook in this case, which partners with the National Venture Capital Association to put out quarterly reports. And that's the quarterly Venture Monitor reports, they're called. So the criteria, in addition to venture capital funding, I've been talking about that a lot, are NIH funding, because that pays for basic research, and that's a big funding source for the universities and institutions that do biotech research. Patents. Now, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office redid their database a year and a half ago, so you can now drill into patent families. So those are sets of related patent applications, because many times a patent filer will look to have the same application in several countries. There may be different versions as they revise an application. So patents is another criterion. Lab space, because companies that are growing need to move into a place where they can do business. And then jobs. And again, the sources for which the NIH has a database available called the NIH RePORT. They update that every week. So you can get pretty up-to-date numbers for the current fiscal year, and you can go back several fiscal years. For the venture capital funding, as I mentioned, the regional groups usually have their own numbers, but if they don't, you can rely on PitchBook and the National Venture Capital Association. In some cases, commercial real estate brokers may have numbers, but I find them to be even better at their forte, which is lab space figures. And the number of jobs, that number would come from regional life science groups, although sometimes commercial real estate firms have numbers as well. So we figured on 5 criteria that you can use to compare the health of the top regions and some up-and-coming regions if you choose to drill down into those. Now, you mentioned biotech versus biohealth, and I thought it was interesting. We have a sister publication called Inside Precision Medicine, which is the migration of omics technologies into clinical practice, whether by healthcare providers or by research hospitals. And that certainly gets into more of the health issues. And Jen doesn't cover that as much, which is why you see either biotech or biopharma being used, but the company realizes it. And in fact, Inside Precision Medicine has grown over, 11 years that we started under the name Clinical Omics, and it's become a solid publication for us. And it serves a little bit of a different niche, but one that needs to be covered as well.
Right. Well, you've answered the question that always in the audience, when you come to our bioforum, someone always asks from the audience about the biohealth versus the biotech. So you've just given an explanation for that. And I don't know if they will be listening to this podcast, but basically you've answered their question in advance, but I'm sure that they will ask again. So you already have your answer.
I'll answer it again.
Yeah, you'll answer it again. The other thing that was interesting last year is we had sort of you and Pete Briskman from JOL at the podium at the same time. I think we'll do that again because the dynamic was very good between the two of you, having a commercial real estate developer who focuses on the wet lab space and someone who's tracking all of the other indicators within the industry. And it created some very good interplay between the two of you at the podium.
And Pete does a really good job with the regions lab space picture. He's got some very good, solid information, and I get interested hearing his presentation as well as
listening to yourself.
Yeah.
So without further ado, I know our listeners are anxious to hear what are the current trends, what's the rankings this year, and what are you seeing as any major regional shifts or major trends occurring within the regions, Alex? So I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. As I mentioned, I'll start again with the biggest change, which is the change on top. Boston, Cambridge retaking the top spot on the cluster list over the San Francisco Bay Area, with the biggest factor in that being Boston, Cambridge regaining the lead in venture capital financing. But there was another factor as well, in that San Francisco, even though it finished on top in terms of number of jobs, that number went down by about 2,000 jobs. And we've seen this year at least 8 companies cutting jobs in that region this year. And they range from Homegrown BioMarin Pharmaceutical and Senti Biosciences and Tenaya Therapeutics to biopharma giants that have a presence in that region. Bristol Myers Squibb cut an unknown number of jobs, but they did shut down their cancer immunology and cell therapy thematic research center in Redwood City. Genentech cut more than 400 jobs. Pfizer, Sanofi, and Thermo Fisher Scientific also eliminating jobs. In the case of Sanofi, they have a subsidiary called Amunix Pharmaceuticals, and that operation now will be absorbed into the broader Sanofi, which accounts for that cut. And beyond 1 and 2, the BioHealth Capital Region, which is Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., still number 3. And I'll have a little more on that, or I can talk about it now. Let me go down the list first. New York, New Jersey, remaining 4th. And when I say New Jersey, that's northern New Jersey, suburbs of New York City, because parts of southern Jersey are in greater Philadelphia, which is number 6th on cluster list. That's actually up a notch. San Diego is 5th this year, and that went up a couple of spaces. Los Angeles, Orange County down to 7th position this year. Actually, most of the biggest activity, at least in the first half of this year with Los Angeles and vicinity, taking place involving the University of California system as opposed to publicly traded employers. So I found that interesting. Number 8, North Carolina. Number 9, creeping up a space, is Chicagoland, which is Chicago and vicinity, and Seattle rounding out the list at number 10. A couple of things in that list. San Diego increased by 2 spaces to number 5, and there are really 2 reasons for that. One, they've seen huge jumps in venture capital, especially in the first half of this year. There were 2 mega financings. Element Biosciences in July closed on a $277 million Series D. Well, we'll see that. It's just representative of the trend, but here's a bigger one. Mirador Therapeutics, which is a precision medicine developer which focuses on immunology and inflammation, attracted $400 million in one shot, and that was in March. The second reason is a huge boom in lab space. 2 mega projects, one being completed in the downtown coast where IQHQ is building the RAD, or Research and Development District. And then further inland in Sorrento Mesa, Sterling Bay and Harrison Street are building a 500,000 square foot campus. The key challenge there is, even though there's more space being built, we haven't seen anything about biotech tenants taking large amounts or any amounts of space in these 2 campuses. We saw on a smaller scale, though, where Pfizer Oncology agreed to lease 230,000 square feet in Torrey View at the Torrey View campus of Breakthrough Properties. But the challenge going forward for San Diego is going to be finding companies to fill all that space that's being built. And they're not the only region with that, but that issue seems most pronounced focus there. Greater Philadelphia went up, I say, because of its sharper focus on one niche within biotech, which is cell and gene therapy development, as well as a jump in venture capital. But on the cell and gene therapy front, the biggest example of that is Spark Therapeutics building their Gene Therapy Innovation Center on the Drexel U campus in Philadelphia's University City. And that would be 500 jobs when it's completed, which is projected at 2026. Although Spark also made news earlier this summer, because they began to lay off an unspecified number of staffers as they pivot to fewer but faster pipeline development there. Looking elsewhere, I mentioned on the Los Angeles, Orange County front, the biggest story there was UCLA buying a vacant shopping mall and making it the California Center for Immunology, which is supposed to open in 2027, talk about a ways away, and for which the state announced $200 million in funding for that, while UC Irvine got a $50 million donation from Charlie Dunlop, the founder of Ambry Genetics. However, there's a possibility for a comeback in LA because Amgen saw its biggest stock gain in May after CEO Robert Bradway said the company's planning a phase 3 trial of a weight loss drug called Maritide, and they hope to be the 3rd big competitor to Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly in that. And Novo Nordisk and Lilly have both staked a growing presence in North Carolina, with Novo Nordisk announcing a $4 million project, a second fill-finish plant in Sanford, and Eli Lilly also building a new facility there as well.
Interesting trends that you're talking about. And actually, it really changes from market to market based on who the major engines are that are potentially growing or basically downsizing, as you mentioned. And there's a lot of movement within the big pharma and the big bio area these days. And it really relates to reorganizations, acquisitions, downsizing, deciding to spin off different technologies or disease groups from their companies where they don't really fit their long-term strategies. So what are you seeing really as the disease or therapeutic areas that appear to be the growth areas that you're observing, Alex?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's more than cancer at this point. I'm seeing a lot of activity on 2 fronts. One is immunology and inflammation, so things that are pain related for sure. The other is, as I mentioned, weight loss. The GLP-1 glucagon-like peptide 1 drugs have really reshaped and created a whole set of blockbuster medicines. Novo Nordisk's semaglutide, which is marketed as Ozempic and Wegovy. Eli Lilly has their own GLP-1 drug as well. And earlier this year, I visited Framingham, Massachusetts, because Novo Nordisk grew further a research hub that they've established in the Boston, Cambridge area. And what they did there was open roughly 80,000 square foot space in Lexington, Massachusetts for global nucleic acid therapies. That includes the RNA-based drugs that we hear about, and advanced drug delivery R&D groups. And they have Novo, it's not a huge number of new jobs with that expansion. 75 is what they're planning for this year. But it goes to show that they're in a steady mode of growth there and in other regions, like North Carolina, for example. And Lilly is as well. There's a scramble within biopharma among companies to try to be the third biggest weight loss drug developer. That's where Amgen comes into play. On a smaller company, Viking Therapeutics is trying as well. And that indication has been takeoff. Why? Because it's a lot easier to take a pill than to try other means of losing weight in many cases. But of course, one must be careful and make sure it applies to the individual. But we've seen where those are having an effect on the list, for example, as well as for the BioHealth Capital Region. Had some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, we didn't mean to skip over the BioHealth Capital Region since that's the primary focus of my responsibilities. So why don't we drill down a little further on us holding the number 3 position, which we got last year for the first time, and we're able to maintain that in 2024, which we're very proud of. So Alex, talk a little bit about your perceptions on the BioHealth Capital Region.
Sure. I would say that the BioHealth Capital Region has one complete strength because it leads the nation in patent activity. I counted 73,000 and change patent families. There's one clear area of challenge in venture capital. Even though the BioHealth Capital Region went up in terms of rankings from 8th to 5th in venture capital year over year, and the amount of funding is $2.9 and change billion since the start of 2023 into the first half of this year. That total $2.93 billion that I counted is more than double what was tallied last year, $1.437 billion. That's a 104% increase. So at least that's going in the right direction, although that still lags the other criteria. Now, on why that is, venture capital activity is something you just don't see as much of because the region is blessed from having both institutions that are large, that are anchors for the region. And I'm thinking of Johns Hopkins University when I say that, as well as the big regulatory agencies, the FDA and the NIH, but also larger companies that have built, I think of Kite Pharma, for example. More recently, the announcement of AstraZeneca building a manufacturing facility in Rockville, Maryland, and planning to create 150 jobs when that opens in 2026. The most recent opening as a deadline was when QIAGEN completed a 40,000 square foot expansion in Frederick, Maryland, resulting in, well, actually, it's a more than doubling of their space. The total combined is 75,000 square feet focused on next-gen sequencing, genomics, clinical healthcare, and forensics. So again, these are larger. These are not startups or early stage companies depending on gobs of venture capital funding, which is why the VC numbers tend to be lower. But as I mentioned, looking at the other 3 criteria, the BioHealth Capital Region is a solid third in NIH behind Boston and New York. Looking also at lab space, a solid 35.9 million square feet of lab space counted. That includes the NIH lab space, which I remember when we first started doing this list, I remember you and some of the people at the event would ask, well, why isn't that counted? And finally, the real estate firms started counting it. And at that point, I felt comfortable enough to include it as well. And we've made that change over the years. And then jobs is still a solid third, which is really good to see for the region. So, yeah, it's become a solid part of the country and one that's been recognized, I think, beyond just the region or the Northeast.
Yeah, one of the things that we like to talk about also is how things have developed or emerged there, have grown, and then morphed into something much bigger. And one of the biggest examples of that is MedImmune, of course, which was acquired by AstraZeneca, but they had created an internal spinoff called Viela Bio. Viela Bio spun out and then was acquired by Horizon Therapeutics from Ireland. And then Horizon was acquired by Amgen most recently. So if you look at that and what happens, that's sort of like the hybrid-tech dynamics that you saw occurring in San Diego, which had all of those spin-outs that emerged from it and created a lot of things to occur in the San Diego area. We're seeing the beginnings of some of those things with the spin-outs and the serial entrepreneurs happening within the BioHealth Capital Region, which took a long time for us to get there. But the other thing that's exciting is when you had Horizon and Amgen coming in, looking at these assets, they made the decision to keep the companies there rather than acquire them and move them to other locations around the country. So that's something that we also think helps contribute to the growth of our region in the last couple of years, Alex.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder how much of that reflects any particular retention strategy. You know, a lot of regions have a big emphasis, understandably so, and traction, drawing companies, drawing jobs. It would seem the challenge is keeping what you have and doing that. And I don't know how much of that is either efforts by the BioHealth Capital Region or the individual states, Maryland and Virginia, focused on that. How's retention accomplished?
I think that's a great comment because there's a recent report that came out by CBRE on talent in the United States. I don't know if you've seen it, but they do a ranking every year on talent and research and development talent. And we consistently in our region are ranked in the top 3 for talent. And if you look at what's going on to grow a company, or if you're looking to acquire assets in a certain region, you want to make certain that they have the talent necessary for the growth that would be needed to grow these companies. And we have a plethora of PhDs and scientists because you mentioned NIH and FDA and Johns Hopkins, University System of Maryland and Georgetown and UVA and Virginia Tech. We have great talent within our region. I think that's helped contribute to our growth in your rankings as well, because if you don't have the people, you're not going to be able to support the existing companies, grow new ones, or protect those who want to acquire assets within your region.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, you have to keep people in the region because that comes up in areas that are more expensive. The issue is then people migrate and they go away.
Yeah, I think that's another trend you might be seeing. But San Francisco and Boston, New York are extremely expensive, both in lab space and wages. So I think that helps contribute to some of the other regions and cities that you have on your rankings that might offer something more affordability so you can get a greater return on your investments you're making. But I think what they've also learned that if you don't have the talent to build your companies in this region, which you might have to pay a little bit more for, you're not going to be able to focus on the growth that you are anticipating within those companies. So it's a delicate balance. It's not just about the cost. You got to have the right mix of all of the ingredients to grow your businesses, but talent, cost of living, quality of life, affordable lab space, access to great research, partnerships, all of those things, I think, are important dynamics, which the BioHealth Capital Region has focused on over the last 10 years for its growth.
Now, the CBRE report was interesting because basically it's a report of 3 mini rankings. They looked at biopharma talent. They looked also at medtech talent and also biomanufacturing talent. And they found differences between the regions, which makes sense because different regions have different strengths in that. But it was good of CBRE to recognize that and drill down a little bit into that in their study, which makes it more valuable. And over time, and he would be a good guest one of these days for this podcast, Matt Gardner at CBRE.
I'm glad you brought that up. We just did a podcast with him.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so if you check your BioTalks, you'll see that Matt Gardner was just last week's BioTalk.
Oh my
talking
gosh.
about that study. Thank you for the suggestion. But,
Okay.
my goal in life and Andy Eckert's goal in life, our producer, is to try to stay one step ahead of Alex Philippidis.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, it's funny.
Hey, there's another term that keeps coming. We talk about venture capital, and this isn't really on the script that we were going to talk about, but I want to get your perspective. If you look at investment right now and also the integration, as I talk about technology and bio coming together, artificial intelligence is everybody's talking about it right now. So whether it's clinical trials or looking for pipeline development or how to incorporate it into services within the healthcare industry, AI is sort of like biotechnologies came a name when it came out. It's like nanotechnology when it came out, and everybody was hot on all of these emerging trends. So what's your perspective on AI and the implications within the bio industry, Alex?
Boy, has that become one of the most talked about specialties. And I think it's because of the promise that at least those who practice AI will say, which is that it will cut years from the development and thus millions, if not billions of dollars from the development of new therapies. We have to wait and see, because the key question for me is how well will AI designed drugs do in clinical trials? Now, there are several that have reached at least phase 2, if not phase 1. And it's interesting. Just yesterday, a group of colleagues shared with me a top 10 list floating around on LinkedIn of artificial intelligence in drug discovery, sort of their top 10 companies. I can't figure out what the criteria were, but what surprised me was that at least half the companies on the list were big time tech companies: Microsoft, IBM. I was at a panel earlier this year with some other journalists who specialize in biotech, and it seems some of them were jaded and faded on AI from now, but a lot of that's because of heavy PR hype from individual companies. But I'm still waiting to see how well the candidates do and whether AI leads to hype or leads to hope. There's a lot of different directions companies can go. If it isn't straight out drug discovery AI, you have companies like NVIDIA, which have made chips that are used for drug discovery as well as broader healthcare applications. And waiting to see how the field shakes up. We haven't gotten that sense yet, but it's something that you see a lot of discussion about, and a lot of concern as well. Will AI be able to cut the cost of drug discovery? Also, Recursion, a company that has a lot of activity in drug development with an AI focus. And the field will shake itself out over the next couple of years.
Well, thank you for your perspective. I think it's something we're all anxious to monitor and watch. And I know we have a couple of CRO companies that we work with closely, and they're using that in some of their clinical trials development, working with big pharma around the world. And if you look at talent, that's another talent area we're seeing, is the computer scientists and people who have AI, quantum, and machine learning experience is also in more demand now by the biopharma industry. So a trend worth watching, but too early to determine what it's going to end up being in 5 to 10 years from now, Alex. So thank you for your perspective. Is there anything that we haven't covered in trends or in general related to the biopharma industry that you cover that you'd like to have our listeners learn about or hear about from you?
Sure. I wanted to promote Jen's flagship virtual event, The State of Biotech, and that's the virtual conference taking place September 11th. It's sponsored exclusively by Cytiva, and we'll have a very outstanding group of research and business leaders from industry and academia discussing research developments, innovations, and regulatory changes. We have 3 keynoters: David Altshuler of Vertex Pharmaceuticals, which made history in December when they won the first FDA approval for a CRISPR-based therapeutic. We have a keynote by Sonia Balab, who co-leads the initiative to develop Preventive Drugs for Prion Disease at the Broad Institute, and a keynote presentation from the new president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, and that's John Crowley, who for a long time led Amicus Therapeutics. We'll also have a CRISPR therapy discussion with leaders from the Innovative Genomics Institute and the Danaher, which is based in Washington, D.C., right in the BioHealth Capital Region.
Great. It's great that we have your program the week before we have the BioHealth Capital Region Forum, which is September 17th and 18th and 19th. And this is our 10th annual, by the way, Alex. So you're going to get to be at our 10th annual BioHealth Capital Region Forum. So you can get a primer to things happening in the industry by going to the Gen event virtually on September 11th, and then in person. The listeners can come to the BioHealth Capital Region at US Pharmacopoeia September 17th, 18th, and 19th. So we've been talking with Alex Philippidis, who is our expert on emerging and existing biopharma clusters, who's the senior business editor with Genetic Engineering Biotechnology News. We want to thank Alex for appearing on BioTalk, and this will not be the last time, Alex. We know it will happen again at least next year. And we also are looking forward to seeing you in person on September 17th as you give one of the opening remarks to our audience related to the trends in the top 10 biopharma clusters again. So, Alex, thank you for being on BioTalk.
Thank you, Rich, for having me here, and thanks for inviting me to the forum as well. It's an honor.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.